Hi everybody, it's Lauren. I live over here in Deer Park, and today I'm going to show you how I bake my sandwich bread. This is a sandwich bread that I make like maybe every couple of weeks, and it freezes real nicely so you can save it for whatever you need it for. So what I've done is I've got all our ingredients all set out for you, and I'll be putting the recipe at the beginning of this video so that you can copy it down. And then I'm just going to work you through step by step how I do it. So here we go. Okay, so we're going to start by proofing our yeast. Proofing your yeast is a very important step, especially if you don't bake a lot. It is the only way that you can know if your yeast is actually alive before you start using it. So rather than wasting all of your time and all of your other ingredients, you proof your yeast and you make sure that everything's good to go before you start. So I have here 4 ounces of warm water. They just came right out of the tap. There's some temperatures indicated on the recipe. If you don't already have an instant read thermometer like this one, I can tell you they're very handy to have. We use this one for everything from meat to fish to bread making, so it's a very good thing to have. This is my yeast. It is 1.5 packets, or 3 3/8 of a teaspoon. I'm going to pour that in with it. And then I have a 1/2 teaspoon of regular granulated sugar, and that's going to go in too. The yeast needs something to eat. The warm water activates it. The yeast needs something to eat. That's the purpose of the sugar in there. And as the yeast wakes up and comes out of its dormancy and starts to consume that sugar, it essentially leaves off gas as a byproduct, and that's what makes your bread nice and light and fluffy. So we're going to let this go for a minute, and I'll show you what it'll look like after it's been set to proof for a few minutes. You should always do this before you start baking to make sure that your yeast is actually alive. Okay, so the yeast has been proofing for a few minutes, and you'll notice that it went from being these small little granulated guys into kind of a fluffy, foamy looking kind of substance, and that means that the yeast is alive, that it's doing its thing, and so we can move on. What we're going to do next is start adding all of our other ingredients in, and I've got them all set out for us here. We've got 1.5 cups of warm milk. Again, the temperature is in the recipe, and I measured that with my thermometer. I'm going to put that in. I've got more granulated sugar. It's 4 tablespoons this time. That's going to go in. And then I have 3 tablespoons of butter that's been melted, and all that's going to go in. You know, do your best to try to get kind of all the butter out of there. The fats give a real nice mouthfeel to the bread whenever it's been all cooked up, and it helps keep it from feeling real dry and kind of crumbly. Okay, and then I have my bread flour and my salt. I use kosher salt for pretty much everything, but you can use granulated salt, that's fine, regular table salt. Bread flour is important because bread flour has a higher protein level than regular all-purpose flour does, and the protein is what allows that gluten to be a really strong bind together, and that gives you a really nice close texture for your sandwich bread. So I'm going to go ahead and put maybe about half of this in. This is 3 cups right now. We're probably going to use about 4 cups, but this is 3 cups right here, and I'm going to put about half of it in, and then I'm going to attach my dough hook to my mixer and start that going. If you don't have a mixer and you don't have a dough hook, you can do this by hand inside a large bowl with a wooden spoon. That's totally okay. It's just obviously a lot less work if you have the mixer. I always lock my mixer whenever I'm using it so that it doesn't bounce all over the place. As we put more flour in, you'll see that that'll be more of an issue. But I'm going to let this stir up for a little while. If you're using your KitchenAid, if you're using a mixer, you don't ever want to go beyond 2 on your mixer when you're mixing dough. It's too much for most of the KitchenAids that most of us have. It's too much for the motor, you'll blow up your motor. So even working with this dough, I usually stick to stir and maybe 2. I might get to 2 sometimes, but I'll even begin to feel my mixer getting a little bit warm towards the back whenever I'm doing that. So after a little while there, it's all starting to incorporate a little bit on here, and that's when I'm going to put in my salt and the rest of my flour. Salt decreases yeast activity, so I don't like to put my salt in too early because it can slow down the activity of the yeast a little bit. For something like this, you're using enough yeast that it's not really too much of an issue, but for other things like when you're making sourdough, you always want to do a stage where you combine like your sourdough starter and your water and your flour, and then wait a little while. It's called the autolyze stage, and you let that go for 20 minutes, half an hour, and then you add your salt in. That way you're giving your yeast time to work and do their thing. So I'm going to put the rest of this 3 cups of flour in here, and we'll mix it up some more, and then I'll try to zoom in a little bit and show you guys what it actually looks like inside of here before we add more flour in, because we'll end up doing that. You should be able to see it coming together pretty well now when you look inside your mixing bowl or when you look inside whatever you're stirring with. I still have a fair amount of flour stuck to the sides of my bowl, but that'll slowly get incorporated as the dough, the flour, the moisture is incorporated all throughout the flour, and so it'll grab onto the sides and suck that up pretty well. Okay, so when I stop it now, most of my flour has been incorporated into the liquid there. So you can see that it's kind of this, you can see it's like dripping down this battery gloopy mess. That's because we need to add some more flour to it. So generally I add about another cup of flour, and I add it in increments so that you don't add too much at once. So I'm going to add about a half a cup now, and then I'm going to see what happens with it. This can all change based on the humidity of your day, the humidity of your flour, how it's been stored. Even if you have a humidifier in your house, that can change the way that your dough is going to come together. So every time it's a little bit different. You always need to sort of play it by ear. So now that that has been incorporated in, you can see that it's still kind of a gloopy battery kind of thing. And instead of having flour stuck on the sides, now you have this kind of sticky dough stuck on the sides. So I'm going to add in another half a cup of flour, and that should take care of that. And this whole thing should come together into like kind of a nice tight ball. So we'll take a look at that whenever that happens. Okay, so now you can see that it's kind of all staying together. It's really wrapped around the dough hook, and it's all coming together quite a bit. So once you get to this stage, with the mixer, you want to go ahead and lock your mixer, put it on stir, and let it go for about 8 minutes. And it'll come together and form this really nice ball of dough that looks pretty smooth. It looks like it has a kind of a really nice flat texture to it. Generally, I have to literally set a timer and walk away so that I make sure I let it go for long enough, because otherwise I'll kind of try to jump the gun. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that on, and we'll check back with it whenever that's all done. Okay, so I'm all done with the kneading stage, and so we'll see what it looks like now. You can see that it climbed up the dough hook quite a bit, all wrapped around here, which happens pretty often. You just go ahead and pull it down. This is the part where you start to get messy if you've been doing this with the mixer. Slide it all down the dough hook, and then I take my dough hook off, and I use my hand to get the dough together into a ball as best I can. You want to try to get as much of this out of here as you can because that's what you're making your bread with. So, pop my bowl off, and I'm going to go ahead and slide my mixer out of the way. Okay, so now I have this nice ball of dough, and it's nice and elastic and feels kind of springy. It doesn't break very easily. You gotta pull pretty hard. Okay, so what you're gonna do is you're gonna get as much of it out of your bowl as you possibly can. I have a dough scraper that I'll use for this sometimes, but this one stayed together pretty well. There's not too much in there. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna hand knead it for a minute before we put it up to rise, before we let the dough proof for a little bit. But one of the first things that you need to do before you start getting super messy is if you're going to let it proof in the same bowl that you mixed it in, make sure you spray that bowl out with Pam. Otherwise you will never get your dough back out of there. So whenever you're going to hand knead it, all you want to do is pull it away from you and bring it back. Pull it away and bring it back. Pull it away and bring it back. And the more you do that, you'll feel it getting more and more smooth and elastic. You might rotate it a little. I kind of rotate mine a little, you can see. But you'll feel it getting more and more elastic and forming this really nice smooth ball. Any little guys that you have kind of hanging out here off your fingers on the countertop, you can incorporate those back in to try to get the last little bit of everything in there. Okay, and you don't really need to do this too much. It's just this last little bit to kind of try to bring it all together. I always form mine into a nice tight ball whenever I'm done. And then I pop this guy right back in the bowl. Okay, here he is ready to go. What you're going to do now is you're going to let your dough proof, which means you're going to let it rise. You want to put it somewhere in your house that is not drafty, somewhere that is a fairly warm temperature, kind of controlled. Obviously you don't want anything to get on it. So I have this handy dandy silicone cover that I can put right over top of mine. You can use a clean kitchen towel, you can use saran wrap, you can use pretty much anything you want as long as dog hair in my house, or dander and dust and things like that aren't going to get in there. I let my dough rise in the microwave. This mixing bowl fits perfectly right in my microwave. You're going to let it rise for about an hour, and by the time you go back and look at it, it's going to be pretty much covering the top of this thing. So we'll check back then. So now it's been about an hour, and you can see when you look at your dough that it is significantly larger than it was before. So what you're going to do is uncover it. This is my handy dandy dough scraper. It's just a piece of plastic. I think I maybe even got it from Giant Eagle, maybe from Michael's Packetans before it became Michael's. But they're real cheap and are real easy to use for things like this because you can scrape right along the edge with the rounded edge, and then whenever we have a big block you can use the hard edge to cut it. So I'm just going to go ahead and gently peel all the dough away from the sides. You'll be able to see all the bubbles in it from all the yeast doing their thing. And then onto a clean countertop, just dump it out. Okay, now you'll have this nice kind of elastic dough here. And all you want to do is just gently cut it into two pieces. Okay, so you're just going to use this guy. If you don't have one of these, you can use a knife. You can use any kind of sharp object. Don't use a real sharp knife, obviously. You want to break them into two basically the same size pieces. You can see that this one is larger than this one. That's okay. It doesn't matter too much. I might lop a little bit off to try to make them a little closer. Okay. Then what you're going to do is you're going to have your loaf pan. It's just a standard loaf pan. They usually come in a set of two. You're going to need two. Spray them down with your Pam. Try to make sure you get the sides real well, because the dough is going to rise up inside of the pan, and it's going to be on the sides, obviously. Okay, once you've done that, go ahead and take your dough, and you want to spread it out into a rectangle. Doesn't need to be huge, doesn't need to be thin, just needs to be a nice size rectangle. And then starting close to you, you just peel up the end and you just gently roll it over. A lot of you maybe have made cinnamon rolls or cinnamon bread, things like that. It's the same kind of concept. You don't want to pull up and then go over because you'll get air pockets in there. You also don't really want to put flour on your surface because as you roll, the flour will keep the dough from bonding with each other, with itself, and you'll get air pockets in there. So once you get to the end, you're going to have this line right here and these kind of wiggles in here on the sides. And so you just want to pinch those together. I usually do my sides first, and then I just gently pinch together the two sides of the seam that's on there. And then I roll it back over again and give it a gentle rocking back and forth. And that'll form it into a nice loaf shape. And then you just put that into one of your tins. You can see it doesn't take up too much space inside the tin. There's lots of room to move around. And then you're going to do the same thing with the other one. You can see none of this is really like super complicated. My kids usually help me with this. My daughter likes to do it. She's probably in the other room right now, a little frustrated that she's not able to help me right now, but I wanted to, give you guys the best I could. So it's really easy to do. So you roll it up again, just like the first one. Seal the sides, and then pinch your seam down, and then gently roll it again. You shouldn't have too much sticking to your countertop because you sprayed your proofing bowl in the first place. So you can see when I pull this up, there's nothing left behind on my countertop. So you slide this one in again, and we're going to let these rise again in here until they're basically going to be level with the top of your pan. It's roughly doubled. So I stick mine right back in the microwave again. And while these are rising for the second time, you can also turn on your oven now to 350, and that lets your oven warm up and get to a good hot temperature while these are rising, so everything's all ready to go in whenever we're done. Whenever these have risen, I'll come back and I'll show you how to score them, how to put any toppings on, and explain why those two things are important or how to do them is important. So that's about it. See you in a little bit. Okay, so now maybe 15 minutes have gone by. Your oven is probably preheated to 350. Should be all good by now. So the only thing left to do is to prep your loaves for baking. My personal preference is I do a milk wash, and then I put some sesame seeds on top. Sometimes when my daughter helps me, we put chia seeds on top so that we can see hers versus mine and see who's turned out better. But most of the time I just do the milk wash and the sesame seeds. The last time I made a loaf, I did an egg wash instead, and it has a shiny, like almost veneer on the top of the loaf, which is kind of cool, and it tasted nice. It was a little bit crispy. I just didn't like how it looked quite as well. So what I do with this is I just brush the milk all over the loaf. You just want to make sure you get all of the little areas over to the sides. Sometimes there'll be little bumps and things in it. You want to get all the way down to the side of the container, of the loaf pan. Do both of them. And hopefully you guys found that making this bread isn't quite the horrible, crazy process that you thought it was going to be. It's really pretty easy. Okay, and then I take my sesame seeds. And what I do is I buy the sesame seeds in the Asian section because it's a container that's 2 times the size of the sesame seeds in the spice area for $1 more. So you get 2 times as more for what ends up being about $4 less. And I just spread these guys over top. Sometimes they're roasted so they're a little bit more sesame flavored than the other ones are. If that bothers you, then you can use something else. Okay, you want to have fairly good coverage on it, and then you'll notice a lot of them fell right off. Okay, and as your bread grows, in the oven, they might fall off as well. So what I do is I go back over and put more milk on, and that'll help them adhere to the dough just a little bit more. Sometimes you can see like large bubbles inside the dough underneath here. That's okay. It's just places where the yeasties are growing and doing their thing, and gonna have a nice fluffy loaf from that. Okay, the last thing that you need to do before you put your bread in the oven is score it. I have this fancy little tool called a lame. It basically just holds a double-edged straight razor. You can use a kitchen knife, you can use anything that's going to be sharp enough to actually slice through it. And why you score this? You score your bread because your bread's going to rise in the oven. And when you score it, you give the dough a place to open up. If you don't give the dough a place to open up, it'll find another place. It'll go wherever it can, wherever the weakest point is. So if that's over on one of the sides where you tucked a little bit, or your seam at the bottom, and you'll have this funky looking loaf that'll turn out all kinds of different shapes. But if you score it, and I just run a straight line right down the middle of my loaf, and you'll see it open up real nicely. Just run a straight line right down both of them. So if you score it like this, then your dough has a place to open up, and the bread has a place to rise while it's in the oven, and you can make sure that you end up with a real nice looking loaf at the end. So sometimes I'll go back and kind of double it up a little, make sure it's deep but not too deep, maybe about 1/4 inch. You can see this one has opened up already a good bit from where I released that pressure. And then I'm just going to go ahead and stick these in the oven. I put these in on the top shelf. It is usually like 3 rungs down from the very top, and I put them in so that they're like this. Put them in for 15 minutes, and then I spin them around the other direction, because you may realize that the back or the front of your oven is hotter or colder depending on how your oven works. So this allows them to bake evenly. At the end of 30 minutes, you want to check your dough. You want to check your bread and see if it's cooked. I use that handy dandy thermometer again, and you stick it into the dough, and you want to make sure that you're registering around 200 degrees inside your dough. If you don't have one of these, it should be nice and kind of caramelized brown on the top. If it hasn't gotten to that nice caramel brown, you could maybe leave it in for 5 more minutes. Sometimes mine needs an extra 5 minutes just because, who knows. But it should not go too much longer than that 30 to 35 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and stick these in, and I'll catch back up with you whenever they're all out and baked. Okay, so this is my first loaf that has come out of the oven. I've got my handy dandy thermometer here. Stick it in so that it goes towards the middle, and I'm coming up with 202 degrees here, so that's right about where I want to be. You have to take it out of the pan right away, otherwise your bread will overcook inside the pan, and it'll overheat, and then it'll be real crummy. So pop it on out, and then what I always do is I use these grid lines that are on my dry rack, on my cooling rack, and I line my bread up with them. And what'll happen is these lines that go across here will leave indentations on the bottom of your loaf, and then whenever it's time to slice your loaf, it's much easier to slice it along those lines. You have like a guide, so you can make even slices. So here's my second loaf. Just pulled it out. I'll go ahead and give it a check. Coming up at 202. So I'll go ahead and pull that one out too. And that's pretty much it. The only other thing that you guys need to know is that you have to wait until your loaf is totally cool before you can slice it. If you try to slice it while it's still warm, the gluten will collapse in on itself and you'll end up with mushy, gummy bread, and that's not really tasty. So right now it is about 4:37, and I won't slice this until after dinner tonight, probably about 7 or 7:15. So you want to wait a good long time before you slice it. What I do is I slice both loaves. Maybe I'll pull some out and leave it in a bag on the countertop for us to have for sandwiches for the next day or two, but then all the rest of it goes into a Ziploc freezer bag and goes into the freezer, and it'll stay good in there for, I don't know, probably longer than I've ever left it, probably months, but it'll definitely be good in there for the time that we're all stuck inside here. What I would recommend is whenever I pull them out, I stick them in the microwave for just a little bit so that they can defrost. Maybe not even 30 seconds, and I flip them halfway through so they defrost evenly, and then you go ahead and make your peanut butter and jelly for your kids, make your ham sandwich, whatever it is you're going to have. If you guys have any questions, let me know. I'll be happy to try to answer them for you, but I hope you enjoyed this, and maybe we'll do it again. I don't know. We'll see. So thanks a lot. I appreciate it, guys. Have a great day.